today's episode, we're diving into the most horrifying pet attacks on their owners. From a hand-raised lion named Napoleon striking at a South African barbecue, to a woman convinced her gorilla had human empathy before being beaten to death. It was August 12, 2018. And the eastern Carpathian Mountains cast long shadows across the Popescu farm as the last day of the village harvest festival drew to a close. The air carried the sweet scent of ripening barley mixed with the earthy smell of ancient forests, a pastoral scene that would soon be shattered by primal violence. Lanel Popescu was shaped by the rhythms of rural Romanian life and a deep connection to the natural world. At 55, his weathered hands bore the calluses of someone who had spent decades working the soil. He was known throughout the region as someone with an almost mystical ability to connect with animals. Lanel's reputation as an animal whisperer had been built over decades of successful interactions with everything from injured wolves to abandoned fox cubs. Neighbors often brought him creatures they found in distress, and his success rate was legendary. This track record had given him dangerous confidence in his ability to tame even the most formidable predators. 8 years earlier, a female brown bear, weakened by a harsh winter and unable to care for her newborn cub, had been found dead near the village outskirts. The tiny cub, barely 3 weeks old and weighing less than 2 pounds, would have perished within hours without immediate intervention. When local authorities planned transport to a wildlife sanctuary, Lanel volunteered to provide temporary care. What began as a short-term rescue evolved into something permanent, as Lanel bottle-fed the cub every few hours, kept him warm, and gradually introduced solid foods as he grew stronger. The bear, whom Lanel named Ursu, simply bear in Romanian, thrived under his care and quickly became attracted to his human caretaker. As Ursu grew from a helpless cub into a powerful adult, Lanel constructed a specialized enclosure within his barn, measuring 20 by 30 feet with reinforced wooden walls topped by steel mesh. The space was designed with genuine care for the animal's comfort, complete with climbing structures, a small pool, and areas for both sun and shade. On this August afternoon, the Harvest Festival had drawn several local families to the farm for a traditional end-of-season celebration. Children ran through the barley fields while adults shared homemade tuica and discussed the year's crop yields. The highlight was always Lanel's demonstration with Ursu, an event that had become legendary throughout the region. Eurasian brown bears represent one of Europe's most formidable predator species, commanding both fear and respect from humans for millennia. Adult males can weigh over 600 pounds and stand nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, with curved claws up to 4 inches long and massive jaws designed for crushing and tearing. As the afternoon sun began to descend behind the Carpathian peaks, Lanel prepared for his demonstration. A group of 12 people gathered around the steel bars, including several children who pressed their faces against the mesh for a better view. Among the spectators were longtime neighbors, visiting relatives, and a few tourists who had heard about the famous tame bear. Lanel announced in his methodic Romanian dialect that Ursu was very special, explaining how he'd raised him from a tiny cub and that the bear knew he was family. He unlocked the heavy steel door, carrying a bucket filled with meat scraps, fish, and chunks of bread, the same routine they'd performed hundreds of times before. Lanel stepped confidently into the enclosure, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. Ursu approached slowly, his massive form moving with deceptive grace. At full size, the bear stood nearly as tall as Lanel when on his hind legs, and his bulk made the human appear almost childlike in comparison. But something was different this time. Perhaps it was the presence of many strangers, the unusual sounds and scents carried on the evening air, or some subtle change in Ursu's psychological state that had been building over months or years. Whatever triggered the bear's behavior, it deviated catastrophically from their established pattern. Without warning signs, no defensive posturing, no vocalizations, Ursus suddenly lunged forward with explosive power. His massive jaws opened to reveal 4-inch canine teeth, and he clamped down on Linnell's right shoulder with devastating force. The sound of breaking bones was clearly audible to horrified spectators. Linnell's confident expression vanished, replaced by shock and agony as Ursus' teeth penetrated through his heavy work shirt deep into the muscle and bone beneath. The bucket flew from his hand, scattering food across the concrete floor in a grotesque parody of their usual feeding ritual. Ursus' attack followed the typical pattern of brown bear aggression, a series of powerful bites and swipes designed to quickly incapacitate any threat. With Linnell's shoulder still locked in his jaws, the bear began shaking his massive head from side to side, tearing through muscle, tendons, and ligaments with horrifying efficiency. Spectators erupted into screams, while children were pulled away from the bars by panicked parents. Someone began shouting for help in Romanian, their voice cracking with panic and desperation as the peaceful harvest celebration transformed into a scene from humanity's darkest nightmares. Ursus released his grip only to immediately clamp down on the farmer's chest, his powerful jaws encompassing nearly the entire width of the torso. The bear's weight, over 650 pounds of muscle and bone, drove Linnell to the concrete floor with crushing force. The impact drove the air from his lungs and likely fractured several ribs even before Ursus' teeth found their mark. Blood began pooling beneath the body, spreading across the gray concrete in an ever-widening stain. Linnell's attempts to defend himself were pathetically inadequate against such overwhelming strength. His hands pushed weakly against the massive head, but it was like trying to move a mountain with bare fingers. George Popescu, Linnell's younger brother, grabbed a pitchfork and began striking the steel bars, creating a loud clanging sound in hopes of distracting the bear. He shouted desperately for Ursus to stop, to get away from his brother, his voice breaking with desperation and grief as he watched 8 years of trust and love dissolve into primal savagery. But Ursus was operating on pure predatory instinct now, his domesticated conditioning completely overwhelmed by millions of years of evolutionary programming. The bear stood on its hind legs to his full height, making him appear even more massive, then brought his full weight down on Linnell's prone form with bone-crushing impact. The farmer's ribs cracked audibly under the impact, and blood began flowing from his mouth as internal injuries mounted. Ursus' next bite targeted the abdomen, his powerful jaws clamping down below the rib cage, penetrating through skin and muscle into the abdominal cavity, causing massive internal trauma that no medical intervention could repair. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the evening air, as a neighbor who lived several kilometers away had heard the screaming carried by the mountain wind and called the local gendarmerie. 2 police vehicles raced up the winding dirt road, their sirens wailing across the peaceful countryside. Sergeant Alexandru Radu, a 25-year veteran, emerged with his service weapon drawn. He dealt with various wildlife incidents throughout his career, but nothing had prepared him for this scene. The sight of a mutilated body lying in a pool of blood while a massive bear paced nearby triggered his training in dealing with immediate threats to public safety. With no tranquilizer equipment available and Ursus showing continued signs of agitation, there was no time to wait for specialized wildlife authorities. The rifle shot that ended Ursus' life echoed across the Carpathian foothills, causing flocks of birds to rise from the surrounding forests in a dark cloud. The massive bear collapsed beside Linnell's body, his 8-year journey from orphaned cub to beloved pet to killer finally at an end. Paramedics arrived 20 minutes later, but their services were no longer needed. The coroner's examination revealed massive trauma to the chest and abdomen, multiple fractured ribs, a broken femur, and catastrophic blood loss that had drained the life from a man who believed love could conquer nature's most fundamental laws. It was a dry, blistering day on the 400-acre farm tucked against the Vaal River in Free State, South Africa. The sun beat down relentlessly over the golden expanse of land, the grass swaying gently in the hot wind. The Vaal River, a lifeline in the otherwise arid land, trickled lazily along one edge of the property, offering a cool refuge to the creatures that called it home. Among them was Humphrey, a hippo that had been taken in at a young age after a river flood had left him stranded. Humphrey had been brought to the farm when he was just 5 months old, a helpless infant under the care of Marius Els, a 40-year-old former army major turned farmer. Marius had a history of caring for wild animals, giraffes, rhinos, but nothing could prepare him for the hulking mass that would one day become his greatest companion. The hippo was growing fast. By the time he reached maturity, he was a formidable creature, nearly 2,600 pounds of muscle, with enormous jaws capable of cracking bones with ease. But at the time, Humphrey was still an oversized infant, his innocent eyes following Marius wherever he went, his huge ears twitching at every sound. Marius, who had trained him to open his mouth for teeth brushing and even ridden him in the water, believed that the bond they shared was unbreakable. To Marius, Humphrey wasn't just a wild animal, he was family. The farm was located on the edge of civilization, far from the nearest city. The surrounding land was sparsely populated, and Marius was used to living alongside nature's unpredictability. The river provided for both the land and the animals, and Humphrey had free rein to roam the 400 acres, though Marius made sure the hippo had access to a dam that he had built for his own comfort. For the most part, Humphrey stayed in a large pond he had claimed as his own, where the water was deep enough for him to submerge and move freely. He only wandered when curiosity or mischief called him to explore the rest of the property. Marius thought of Humphrey as the gentle giant, a creature so tame that he would obey Marius's calls. On several occasions, he would make his way to the nearby golf course, where golfers were often startled by the sight of a huge, lumbering hippo. To Marius, these escapades were harmless fun, a playful show of a bond forged between man and beast. Yet each time Humphrey escaped his enclosure, the danger of the situation became more evident. One morning, as Marius tended to the animals, he noticed the hippo had wandered off again. This time, however, Humphrey had ventured out of the farm and down to the river, where he encountered a man and his young grandson paddling along in a canoe. Marius had seen the exchange from a distance, and knowing Humphrey's territorial nature, he rushed to intervene. Humphrey's instincts kicked in as soon as the hippo saw the canoe. Without warning, he charged into the water, moving fast, powerful ripples forming behind him as he cut through the river with frightening speed. The pair in the canoe barely had time to react. The man and his grandson scrambled for safety, climbing the nearest tree as Humphrey circled below, agitated and relentless. Marius reached the scene and, with the sound of his whistle, called the hippo back. Humphrey paused, shaking his head before trotting back to Marius's call. He had been trained, or so Marius believed, to listen and obey. The locals who had witnessed the scene were less convinced. They saw an animal capable of unpredictable aggression, one that had grown beyond the control of even the man who had raised him. Days passed and Humphrey's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He began to kill livestock on neighboring farms and even threw Marius from his back when the hippo no longer wished to be ridden. What Marius once thought of as playful now seemed dangerous. But he continued to dismiss the warnings, too blinded by his affection for the animal. To him, Humphrey was still that innocent young hippo, the one he had raised from a vulnerable age. But Humphrey was no longer a baby. He was becoming an adult, and with adulthood came a growing sense of dominance. His instincts were sharpening, and Marius, though experienced with wild animals, failed to recognize the shift in the hippo's behavior. The once obedient pet was beginning to test his limits. The playful nudges, once affectionate, now carried weight. The bites, which had once been gentle, grew more forceful. On November 12, 2011, tragedy struck. It began like any other day, with Marius heading out to visit Humphrey. The hippo was waiting for him at the riverbank, eager as always for attention. As Marius approached, he offered the usual apple as a treat, but Humphrey seemed different. The usual excitement was there, but something darker had crept into the animal's gaze. Marius attempted to pass the hippo to go down to the water, but Humphrey blocked his path. The massive animal shook his head and grunted, a low, guttural sound that resonated through the air. Marius brushed it off, but as he attempted to step around the hippo, the situation escalated. Humphrey's large jaws opened wide, and for the first time, Marius felt a rush of unease. The hippo's teeth were exposed, the sight of them sending a shiver down Marius's spine. He recognized the signs of aggression, but it was too late. Humphrey lunged, his powerful bite sinking into Marius's torso. The immense pressure of the hippo's jaws shattered Marius's bones. He gasped in pain, but there was no escape. Humphrey came for him again and again, the animal's raw strength overwhelming his former caretaker. Marius's body was soon swept into the river, his life extinguished by the very animal he had raised and trusted. It was hours before his body was discovered submerged in the cold water. The bond that Marius had believed was unbreakable had been shattered. What he had failed to see was the ferocity growing within Humphrey, a force of nature that no amount of training could suppress. Humphrey, the hippo he had once seen as a son, had become something far more dangerous. A wild animal driven by instinct, and in that moment, he had betrayed the only person who had ever cared for him. It was a warm, calm evening in the rolling hills of Ohio, where a man named Sam Mazzola made his living from exotic animals. Sam's property, surrounded by dense woods, was home to various wild creatures: bears, tigers, wolves, all living in enclosures or roaming the grounds. To many, Sam was a controversial figure, revered by some for his expertise and loathed by others for his apparent disregard for animal welfare. Born and raised in Ohio, Sam's passion for animals began early. As a child, he developed an interest in collecting and caring for creatures, a hobby that gradually grew into a full-fledged obsession. Over time, Sam's fascination with exotic wildlife led him to accumulate a variety of dangerous animals. Sam's collection included lions, tigers, and bears, dangerous creatures that, despite their raw power, he believed could be tamed and cared for. He often exhibited them at fairs and public events, offering people a chance to get close to the animals. Sam justified his actions by claiming he was educating the public about conservation, but the truth was more complex. He faced numerous allegations of animal cruelty and neglect. The United States Department of Agriculture had cited him multiple times for violating the Animal Welfare Act, including failing to provide adequate veterinary care and proper living conditions. His license was revoked in 2009, and a fine of $21,000 was imposed for the violations. Yet Sam was allowed to continue housing his animals. Despite the controversies, Sam pressed on with his exhibitions. His most famous animal was Bart, a 500-pound black bear. Sam had raised Bart from a cub, and their bond was well known in the community. The bear would stand on its hind legs when Sam approached, eager for the routine feeding. The two seemed inseparable, and Sam often told visitors how much he trusted Bart, despite the whispers of danger surrounding such a powerful creature. But bonds like these can be fragile, especially when outsiders become involved. Brett Condra, a 24-year-old Ohioan, had long been fascinated by animals. His childhood was spent exploring creeks and rivers in northeastern Ohio, discovering fishing sports and learning to respect the wildlife around him. He would often spend his weekends camping and catching bullfrogs with blades of grass, always surrounded by nature. His family supported his love for animals, and by his 20s, Brent sought work that allowed him to stay close to his passion. When Sam offered him a job on his property, Brent ignored his father's warnings about Sam's business practices and the risks of working with wild animals. The opportunity felt like a dream come true, one he couldn't bring himself to resist. On August 19, 2010, Brent was preparing for the evening feeding when tragedy struck. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the property. With a bucket of raw meat in hand, Brent approached Bart's 15-foot by 20-foot enclosure. Over the years, Brent had grown confident in handling the animals, particularly Bart, who seemed to recognize him and had always been docile in his presence. As usual, the bear stood up on its hind legs, eagerly awaiting its meal. In the early days, Brent had been nervous around Bart, but over time he believed he had earned the bear's trust. He approached with calm and steady movements, respecting the animal's wild nature. Slowly, he unlocked the door to the enclosure and let Bart out. Feeding Bart outside his cage had become a routine, one the bear had grown accustomed to. Brent, confident in their bond, never imagined how quickly trust could shatter. Without warning, Bart lunged at Brent, grabbing him with powerful claws and slamming him to the ground. The 500-pound bear, normally calm, had transformed into a savage force. Brent had no time to react. Bart's claws raked across his body and its teeth sank into his face, tearing through flesh and bone. Brent struggled to break free, but the bear was too strong. Its claws shredded his chest and arms, while its powerful jaws crushed his hand and shattered his ribs. Blood pooled around him as Bart continued the brutal attack. Sam, who had been preparing other animals for the night, heard the commotion and rushed to the scene. He shouted at Bart, trying to distract the bear long enough to stop the attack. With a fire extinguisher in hand, Sam managed to force Bart back into the cage. But the damage was done. Brent lay bleeding on the ground, his body torn apart by the bear's assault. Sam immediately called 911 and Brent was rushed to Metro Health Medical Center. Despite all efforts, Brent died from his injuries shortly after 1:30 a.m. on August 20th, 2010. The coroner's report confirmed that Brent's cause of death was blunt and sharp force trauma consistent with a bear attack. Sam, in a brief interview, spoke carefully about the incident, declining to provide details but mentioning that Brent had been Bart's favorite caretaker. He added that while he respected Brent's family's wishes, he believed Brent would not have wanted Bart euthanized. However, Brent's father and ex-wife insisted on the bear's euthanasia, and a veterinarian carried it out. The tragedy didn't end with Brent's death. In 2011, Sam Mazzola was found lifeless in his home, an eerie scene that only deepened the mystery surrounding his life. Sam's body was discovered handcuffed, face down on his waterbed, wearing a leather mask. The autopsy revealed asphyxiation with a bedroom toy lodged in his throat. The circumstances of his death remain unsolved, adding to the strange and unsettling nature of his legacy. It was January 21st, 2023, when Joseph Austin Smith, a 32-year-old plumber from Wichita, Kansas, left for what was meant to be a routine hunting trip. Joseph was known for his infectious humor. At work, he could always be counted on to bring energy to the morning shift, filling the room with laughter at his jokes. He enjoyed the outdoors and had a passion for both hunting and playing the guitar. On that Saturday morning, he and his friend packed their gear, climbed into the pickup truck, and drove out into the rural countryside of Sumner County, Kansas. Kansas is well known for its hunting opportunities. The state boasts 300,000 acres of public land, along with over 1 million acres of private land open to hunters seasonally. Known as one of the top 3 states for pheasant and quail hunting, Kansas also attracts those pursuing deer, particularly in areas like G Springs, just north of the Oklahoma border. Joseph and his friend had set out that day with intentions to hunt doe, looking to make the most of the weekend. The area was wide open and quiet, an ideal place to hunt. The trip was uneventful at first. The two men chatted as the truck bounced over the rough roads. In the back seat, Joseph's friend's German Shepherd, a large, energetic dog, sat with its head out the window, looking out at the passing landscape. The dog was a familiar companion on their hunting trips, always tagging along, and Joseph knew it well. The truck rolled steadily along the tar roads, and the men began discussing the hunt, making plans for where they would set up when they reached their destination. But in their haste to leave, Joseph and his friend had made a critical mistake. They had carelessly thrown their equipment into the back of the truck, including a loaded hunting rifle. The rifle, while secured in the cab with them, was not properly handled. The safety was off, and the rifle was left in a position where the dog could easily interact with it. Without realizing it, the men had set the stage for a tragedy. As the truck rumbled along the dirt roads, the dog, restless in the back seat, shifted its position. It leaned against the rifle, its large paw pressing down on the trigger. The rifle, previously harmless, discharged with a loud crack that echoed through the cab of the truck. The sound was deafening, the shock of it immediate. The dog leapt backwards, startled by the blast. Its sudden movement caused the truck to swerve, and Joseph's friend slammed on the brakes. The pickup truck screeched to a halt. The air was thick with tension, the ringing in their ears the only sound after the shot. Joseph's friend turned to look at him, expecting him to respond to the noise, but instead found him slouched forward in the seat. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a reaction to the shock of the moment, but when Joseph didn't answer and blood began seeping through his shirt, his friend knew something was terribly wrong. In panic, he shook Joseph's body, calling his name over and over, but there was no response. With his heart racing, Joseph's friend grabbed his phone and dialed 911. The paramedics arrived within minutes, the sound of their sirens cutting through the still air. Blood poured from Joseph's abdomen, the bullet having passed through the back of his seat and struck him directly in the back, severing an artery. The bleeding was rapid and uncontrollable. Despite the paramedics' swift arrival and their desperate attempts at CPR, it was too late. Joseph had succumbed to his injuries right there, on the side of a rural road, with his friend and the dog the only witnesses to the tragedy. The shock of the event rippled through the community. Joseph, the vibrant and always cheerful man, was gone. The dog, though a familiar companion on many trips, had not been harmed. The investigation that followed painted a tragic picture of a preventable accident. Sumner County sheriffs determined that Joseph's friend was innocent, having made no mistakes other than perhaps in not realizing the danger of leaving a loaded rifle in the cab. The firearm had gone off due to the dog's paw pressing on the trigger, a simple yet fatal mistake. A similar incident had occurred years earlier in Turkey, where a man's dog had stepped on the trigger and shot him dead. It was a stark reminder of the potential danger that such seemingly innocent actions could bring. Kansas's Wellington Fire and EMS Chief Tim Hay, speaking to the press, offered advice in response to the incident. Keep the safety on, unload your guns completely when it's in a vehicle, and put it away in the trunk, he said. His words were a call to action for all hunters, underscoring the importance of responsible firearm handling. Joseph's friend, who had witnessed it all, would carry the weight of that tragic day with him forever. A small mistake, a loaded rifle, and a shifted dog had combined in an instant to change everything. The sorrow of losing someone so full of life was compounded by the knowledge that it could have been prevented, a fact that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In the quiet moments after the sirens faded and the investigation concluded, Joseph's legacy lived on through the stories told by those who knew him. His laughter, his energy, and his presence would be missed by all who had the privilege of knowing him. The dog would continue to roam the countryside, but the bond between it and the men who had once shared so many adventures would never be the same. What was meant to be an ordinary hunting trip ended in the kind of tragedy that could have been avoided with simple precaution. On June 12, 2018, the humid Florida air clung to the crowded rental home in Pinecrest, where music and laughter filled the space. The air conditioning struggled against the heat of 20 bodies packed into the living room, plastic cups in hand, as friends and coworkers from Sunshine Market drank and talked over the pulsing music. It was a typical Saturday night, until Hunter Roberts decided it was time to unveil the surprise he had been hinting at all evening. At 34 years old, Hunter had earned a reputation as a risk-taker. Tall and lean, with sun-bleached hair, he had spent his childhood exploring the swamps and backwaters of Central Florida, drawn to the wildlife that most people avoided. While other kids played baseball or rode bikes through the neighborhood, Hunter waded through murky water, flipping over logs in search of snakes and lizards. His fascination bordered on obsession. By the time he was a teenager, he had already built a collection of reptiles, keeping them in makeshift enclosures in his bedroom. Teachers at his high school remembered him as the kid who always had a snake draped around his shoulders, while neighbors grew accustomed to the occasional escaped lizard turning up in their yards. Even as an adult working as a produce manager at Sunshine Market, his real passion remained reptiles. Every spare dollar went toward his collection, buying new enclosures, feeding live prey, or upgrading his backyard shed into what he proudly called his herp room. His roommates, Michael Dawson and Tyler Freeman, tolerated it at first, but as the collection grew, so did their concern. Hunter had always been drawn to larger, more aggressive species, dismissing the risks with a cocky grin. When he first brought home a 5-foot Argentine tegu, they had argued about it, but Hunter waved them off. That pattern continued until one day he brought home something far more dangerous, something that wouldn't just bite, but kill. 3 months earlier, during a solo trip to the Everglades, Hunter had captured something far more dangerous than the usual snakes and lizards he brought home, a fully grown Nile monitor lizard. At over 6 feet long and weighing nearly 30 pounds, the muscular reptile was among the largest specimens ever spotted in the region. Native to sub-Saharan Africa, Nile monitors are one of the most formidable lizards in the world, built for endurance, speed, and efficient predation. Their razor-sharp teeth are designed for slicing through flesh, while their powerful claws make them skilled climbers, burrowers, and aggressive combatants when threatened. Unlike other large reptiles that rely on ambush tactics, Nile monitors are active hunters, chasing down prey with surprising speed, capable of sprinting up to 18 miles per hour. Their highly acidic saliva allows bacteria to fester in their mouths, creating a venom-like effect when they bite. A wound from a Nile monitor doesn't just bleed, it festers, leading to rapid infection. Despite being classified as an invasive species in Florida, their adaptability and aggressive survival tactics have allowed them to thrive. Wildlife officials warn that Nile monitors should never be kept as pets, as they remain unpredictable even when raised in captivity. Territorial and prone to violent outbursts, they use their powerful tails as whips, delivering bone-crushing blows before lashing out with claws and teeth. But Hunter refused to acknowledge the danger. Ignoring warning signs that captured monitors should be reported and euthanized, he smuggled Ra home and set up an enclosure in the backyard shed. He named it after the Egyptian sun god, boasting about its intelligence and strength, but his friends simply called it Hunter's mistake. By the time the party had been going for hours, the drinks had been flowing and the house was hot and stuffy. Guests milled around, laughing and chatting, unaware that the night's entertainment would soon turn deadly. At 11:45 p.m., Hunter clapped his hands for attention, grinning as he boasted about what he had brought back from the Everglades. The shed had been closed up all day, and the heat inside would have pushed Ra into a state of heightened aggression. But Hunter didn't think twice as he disappeared outside. His guests, fueled by alcohol and curiosity, waited for him to return. Moments later, Hunter stepped back into the living room, the massive Nile monitor draped over his forearm. The room fell silent as people instinctively backed away. Unlike a harmless pet lizard, Ra's body twisted and writhed, his sharp claws digging into Hunter's skin as his powerful tail lashed. His yellow eyes darted, scanning the unfamiliar space, muscles coiled tight beneath patterned scales. Guests later described the atmosphere as uneasy. Something about the way the lizard moved didn't feel right. But Hunter, emboldened by alcohol, dismissed their concerns, laughing as he held Ra up for everyone to see. He encouraged people to touch the scaly hide, insisting the animal was harmless if handled properly. Then Ra struck. The lizard lunged forward, its jaws clamping down on Hunter's wrist with shocking speed. The razor-sharp teeth sank in deep, puncturing muscle and tearing flesh. Hunter let out a sharp yell, trying to shake the animal off, but Ra's grip only tightened. Nile monitors are ambush predators, using their teeth to inflict massive wounds and their powerful limbs to rip flesh from bone. Blood splattered onto the tile floor as the lizard began violently thrashing its head, its instincts mistaking Hunter for prey. Panic erupted in the room. Guests screamed, some bolting for the door while others froze in shock. Hunter stumbled away, crashing into the coffee table, knocking drinks to the ground. His attempts to pry Ra off only made it worse. The lizard, now fully in feeding mode, latched onto his forearm and began clawing at his chest. Michael and another guest rushed forward, grabbing Hunter's shoulders to steady him as he fell to his knees, blood pouring from his arm and streaking down his torso. The deep gashes from Ra's claws exposed muscle, and as Hunter struggled, the monitor lunged again, this time sinking its teeth into his throat. The room fell into chaos. Hunter gurgled, his hands clutching at the lizard, but Ra's powerful bite force and serrated teeth dug in deeper. A sickening, ripping sound filled the air as the monitor began tearing at the soft tissue of his neck, blood spraying across the floor. The guests who remained were helpless, some shouting, others dialing 911, but none daring to step closer. The attack didn't stop. As Hunter collapsed onto his back, convulsing from blood loss, Ra released his grip and latched onto his face. Clawed feet pinned his shoulders as the monitor ripped into his cheek, stripping flesh from bone in the way it would with prey in the wild. By the time emergency responders arrived 12 minutes later, Hunter wasn't moving. The first responders forced their way inside, met with the horrifying scene of Ra still tearing into Hunter's body. Blood covered the floor, his face barely recognizable beneath gaping wounds, and the lizard was feasting. Firefighters and paramedics trained in handling Florida's wildlife emergencies worked quickly to contain the agitated, blood-covered monitor. Using catch poles and heavy gloves, they managed to wrestle Ra away from the body, but the damage had already been done. Hunter Roberts was pronounced dead at 12:17 a.m. The autopsy confirmed severe blood loss and trauma to the throat, face, and arms, with bite wounds consistent with predatory feeding behavior. Large portions of his cheek, neck, and forearm had been consumed before first responders arrived. In the aftermath, wildlife officials euthanized Ra, confirming that the monitor had displayed normal predatory behavior for a wild-caught specimen. Experts reviewing the case emphasized that Nile monitors are not pets, and their powerful hunting instincts make them extremely dangerous in captivity. For the partygoers who had witnessed the attack, the trauma lingered. Some refused to speak about it, unable to erase the image of Hunter's final moments from their minds. Others struggled with guilt, wondering if they should have stepped in sooner, though none could have predicted how quickly the situation escalated. Hunter's roommates moved out within weeks, unable to live in the house where it had happened. The few guests who remained at the party that night eventually drifted apart, bound only by the horrific memory that none of them would ever fully escape. For those who had known Hunter personally, his death was a brutal reminder that wild instincts cannot be tamed. In the end, he was never in control, not of Ra and not of what happened that night. It was November 18, 2014, and thick strands of oak and maple trees bordered the Kemp residence in Knott County, Ohio. The remote farmhouse sat on 6 acres surrounded by rolling hills. the perfect setting for Valerie Kemp's dangerous obsession with proving that apex predators could be loving companions. Valerie was driven by desperate need for validation and attention. At 42, she'd spent most of her adult life feeling invisible and unremarkable. Her marriage ended in bitter divorce. Her children rarely visited, and she struggled with profound loneliness. The exotic animal community had become her refuge, a place where she could reinvent herself as an expert. Her transformation from lonely divorcee to self-proclaimed big cat expert had been gradual but complete. She'd spent hours researching tiger behavior, joined online forums, and gradually convinced herself that she possessed special insights into feline psychology. What started as genuine fascination had evolved into dangerous delusion. Valerie had built a passionate community of viewers who tuned in regularly to watch her interact with Shiva, a magnificent Bengal tiger she'd raised from a 6-week-old cub. The tiger had been her constant companion for 5 years, living inside the house like an oversized domestic cat. She genuinely believed their bond transcended the natural order. That evening, Valerie had invited 2 special guests to witness Shiva's grooming routine. Dr. Marcus Webb, a local veterinarian who had repeatedly warned her about the dangers, and Jennifer Martinez, her closest friend who had grown increasingly concerned about Valerie's reckless behavior. Shiva was an absolutely magnificent specimen, measuring nearly 10 feet from nose to tail tip and weighing just over 500 pounds. His coat displayed the classic Bengal pattern, brilliant orange with bold black stripes. His massive head featured piercing amber eyes and 4-inch canine teeth. Bengal tigers represent the apex of feline evolution. Native to the Indian subcontinent, they're the largest wildcats in the world, with males regularly exceeding 600 pounds. Their bite force exceeds 1,000 pounds per square inch. At exactly 7:30 p.m., Valerie positioned herself beside Shiva, who was lying on his side in a relaxed state. She held the professional grooming brush, speaking to her online audience about how gentle and loving Shiva really was. For nearly 12 minutes, the session proceeded without incident, with Shiva remaining calm and cooperative. At 7:42 p.m., Valerie turned her back briefly to adjust the laptop's camera angle. She reached across the coffee table, her attention focused on the screen for perhaps 3 seconds. In that instant, something fundamental shifted in Shiva's demeanor, a switch that flipped from domesticated companion to apex predator. Without warning, the tiger's predatory nature asserted itself with terrifying swiftness. Shiva rose to his feet with fluid grace, his massive frame uncoiling like a spring. The attack was sudden and devastating as the tiger lunged forward, clamping his jaws around Valerie's left thigh, his 4-inch canines penetrating deep into muscle tissue. The force of the bite was so powerful that her femur cracked audibly under pressure. Valerie's scream filled the room as Shiva's grip tightened, his jaw muscles contracting with hydraulic force. Dr. Webb shouted in alarm, reaching for a push broom while Jennifer backed toward the front door. Shiva then began the characteristic head-shaking motion, thrashing his massive head from side to side, tearing through muscle, tendons, and blood vessels. The tiger's weight dragged Valerie down onto the carpet, her back striking the floor with a sickening thud. Shiva repositioned himself over her prone form, his amber eyes displaying the cold focus of a predator in full hunting mode. The tiger's next bite targeted Valerie's torso, clamping down below the ribcage. Crushing force compressed internal organs while canine teeth punctured through skin and muscle into the abdominal cavity. Blood began pooling beneath her body, soaking into the carpet and spreading outward in an ever-widening crimson stain. Dr. Webb finally connected with emergency services, screaming into the phone for immediate assistance. By the time the first police officers burst through the front door exactly 9 minutes after the initial 911 call, Valerie's body had stopped moving entirely. Shiva stood over his victim, blood dripping from his muzzle onto the carpet below. Officers drew their weapons, while the tiger's amber eyes fixed on the new arrivals with predatory interest. Sergeant Rodriguez made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career, raising his weapon and firing 3 shots in rapid succession. It was May 22, 2016, light filtering through the pines above Oakhurst as guests gathered behind Mario DeLuca's cabin for cake and quiet celebration. No one noticed the massive black shape in the tree line, until Mario, spotting it with a grin, raised his phone and remarked that it would make a great photo, words that would be among his last. Mario was a 61-year-old retired chef who had traded the chaos of Modesto restaurant kitchens for what he called simple living close to nature on his wooded parcel near Yosemite. However, his dream of harmony with the wilderness had manifested in the most dangerous way possible, through his relationship with Bobo, a 400-pound black bear he had raised from a cub and allowed to roam freely around his property. Mario's approach to bear management was built on dangerous misconceptions that would prove fatal. He believed Bobo was practically vegetarian, feeding him fruit, bread, and even beer while allowing the massive predator to wander freely between his property and the surrounding wilderness. This habituation, the process by which wild animals lose their natural fear of humans, is one of the most dangerous scenarios in wildlife management. Habituated bears become unpredictable, viewing humans as sources of food rather than threats to avoid. Additionally, despite their seemingly docile reputation, black bears are incredibly powerful omnivores capable of running 30 miles per hour and climbing trees with ease. Their massive paws are equipped with claws up to 4 inches long, designed for tearing apart logs and digging through soil, but equally effective at shredding human flesh. An adult black bear possesses the strength to crush a human skull with a single swipe and can deliver a bite force of over 800 pounds per square inch, enough to crack bones like twigs. Wildlife officers have received multiple complaints about Bobo's presence near residential areas, but Mario's insistence that his bear was harmless had prevented any serious intervention. He regularly boasted to neighbors about their special bond, describing how Bobo would visit his porch and even accompany him to the mailbox. These interactions, which Mario saw as proof of their friendship, were actually warning signs of a wild animal that had lost its natural behavioral boundaries. On May 18th, Mario's birthday celebration seemed like the perfect opportunity to showcase his unique relationship with Bobo. As his 3 guests, an old co-worker, her sister, and a local handyman, enjoyed cake and conversation, the massive bear wandered into view with the casual confidence of an animal that had learned to associate humans with food rewards. Mario's decision to approach Bobo with a slice of birthday cake represented the culmination of years of dangerous conditioning. Bears are opportunistic feeders with an acute sense of smell that can detect food from miles away, and Mario's offering of sweet cake activated the same feeding response that drives bears to raid garbage cans and break into campsites. Only this time, the bear wasn't separated by a fence or fear. Bobo reared onto his hind legs before lashing out with one massive paw. The blow struck Mario across the face, sending him sprawling backward as his guests watched in frozen horror. Black bears killed through a combination of crushing bites and powerful claw strikes, using their incredible strength to overpower prey much larger than themselves. Bobo's jaws clamped down on Mario's leg, dragging him toward the tree line with the methodical efficiency of a predator securing its kill. The bear's subsequent attacks targeted Mario's abdomen and chest, tearing through flesh and bone. The 911 call came at 4:34 p.m. from a passerby who heard the screams echoing across the ridge. By the time deputies and wildlife officers arrived 30 minutes later, Mario was already dead, his body torn apart by the animal he had considered family. A single rifle shot ended both the attack and Bobo's life, but the damage was irreversible. Mario's torso had been torn open, his neck partially severed, his face rendered unrecognizable by the bear's powerful claws. The trail of blood and clothing fragments, stretching from the party table to the forest edge, told the story of his final, desperate moments. Mario's funeral was held 3 days later at a small crematorium in Mariposa. Only close family and a few former co-workers attended. In the days that followed, wildlife authorities conducted a formal investigation and issued a public advisory on the dangers of habituating wild animals. The bear's remains were tested and buried off-site, and the county announced plans to review and strengthen local exotic and nuisance wildlife enforcement protocols. It was just another ordinary Wednesday morning in Moo, a small community in northeast Victoria, Australia. Paul McDonald, a 46-year-old farmer and loving husband, went outside to feed his pet deer, a cross between a red deer and an elk. He had owned the stag for 6 years, and the couple had always considered it a part of their family. The stag, standing almost 6 feet tall at the shoulder, had grown into a majestic creature under Paul's care. But what seemed like a routine task turned into a horrific tragedy. Paul's wife Mandy and their 17-year-old son Ethan heard a commotion coming from outside. As they rushed to investigate, they found Paul being viciously attacked by the animal he had raised and cared for. Mandy McDonald couldn't believe her eyes as she saw her husband being thrown around by the stag. The once docile creature, now acting aggressively, was pouncing on Paul with its sharp hooves and antlers. Mandy's heart raced as she sprinted toward the scene, driven by both terror and determination. The stag's antlers, nearly 2 feet long, thrashed violently, aiming at Paul with each twist of its head. Paul struggled, trying to fend off the attack, but the deer was too powerful. Mandy, getting closer, saw Paul's body being tossed about as the stag pinned him to the ground. Despite the fear and chaos, Mandy's resolve only hardened. She couldn't stand idly by. With a burst of adrenaline, she screamed at the stag, trying to distract it. The animal's wild eyes shifted toward her for a moment. Its aggression diverted just long enough for Paul to regain his footing, but the moment was brief. The stag, now more enraged, turned its focus back to Mandy and charged. Mandy braced herself for the impact. The stag's hooves struck her legs, sending an unbearable pain shooting up her body. She felt its antlers graze her upper arm, tearing through her jacket. The force of the blows nearly knocked her off her feet, but she refused to retreat. Despite the sharp pain and the threat of being gored, she fought to remain standing. Just as Mandy's strength started to falter, she heard Ethan's footsteps behind her. He appeared with a large piece of timber, his eyes wide with determination. Ethan swung the wood with all his strength, striking the stag in the head. The stag staggered back, dazed. Ethan swung again, and the stag, now disoriented, backed away, retreating into the nearby trees. Mandy collapsed next to Paul, bruised and battered but alive. Ethan helped her to her feet, and they turned to Paul. His body lay motionless, a pool of blood forming beneath him. His injuries were severe, and Mandy knew deep down it was too late. She tried to call out to him, but the words stuck in her throat. The first responders arrived moments later. The officers approached cautiously, weapons drawn. The stag, now at a distance, stood with its head lowered in a threatening posture, its massive antlers still sharp and lethal. The officers could see the animal's bloodshot eyes and wild stance. They were aware of the heightened aggression associated with the mating season, which made the situation even more dangerous. The stag snorted angrily, stamping its hooves in warning. The officers exchanged tense glances before slowly advancing. They knew that any wrong move could lead to another deadly attack. As they neared Paul's body, the stag snorted again, its massive body shaking as it prepared to charge. With little choice, the officers raised their weapons. The sound of gunfire shattered the tense silence echoing across the valley. The stag collapsed instantly, its body crumpling to the ground. The officers rushed to Paul's side, but despite their best efforts, he was already gone. His injuries were too severe. The farmer, who had been a well-known figure in the community, was pronounced dead at the scene. Mandy, still in shock and badly injured, was transported to the hospital. Ethan stayed by her side, the weight of the tragedy settling heavily on his shoulders. The community of Moo was left in disbelief. Paul, who had devoted his life to his family and farm, was gone in an instant, taken by the very creature he had raised. The attack sparked a broader conversation about the dangers of domesticating wild animals. Experts noted that attacks by deer were rare, but they emphasized that the mating season could intensify aggression in stags due to higher testosterone levels. Steve Garlick, chairman of the Deer Management Committee at the Australian Deer Association, explained that while deer are generally more likely to flee than fight, the mating season can push them to act out violently if they feel threatened or provoked. Mandy and Ethan, still recovering from their physical and emotional wounds, were left to navigate a future without Paul. The loss was crushing, yet they clung to the memories of a man who had shown them the true meaning of love, strength, and family. It was September 14, 2017, under the harsh New Mexico sun outside Ruidoso Down. At a makeshift sanctuary behind rusted gates, the sounds of children's laughter would soon be replaced by screams as Nina, a 200-pound black jaguar, shattered the illusion of safety that Tyler Qualls had carefully constructed. Tyler was a 46-year-old retired Army medic who had returned from 2 tours in Iraq with shattered nerves and a deep mistrust of civilization. His father's death had left him 6 acres of desert land, which he gradually turned into what he called the micro-sanctuary. The property housed 2 bobcats, a few rescued reptiles, and Nina, the jaguar he considered the crown jewel of his operation. Tyler had purchased Nina from a Texas breeder 2 years earlier, paying in cash and transporting her across state lines in a modified horse trailer. He often said his military background gave him intuitive respect for apex predators, claiming he didn't need formal training. He ran the place alone. No staff, no protocols, no emergency barriers. He rejected tranquilizers and carried no firearm. His solution to danger was confidence, which he believed animals could sense. Once a month, Tyler hosted open house days, low-key events advertised through local forums and word of mouth. Visitors were allowed close-up views of the animals from behind standard chain-link fences. Tyler would lead casual tours barefoot, speaking about natural balance, trust, and how fear is what gets people hurt. His self-printed brochures mentioned animal welfare but omitted any legal disclaimers or real warnings. On the morning of September 14th, 11 visitors arrived, including a couple from Albuquerque with 2 children, a tourist group from Arizona, and 3 local residents. By 10 a.m., they had gathered near Nina's enclosure, a 20 by 30 foot space enclosed by chain-link fencing and shaded by a salvaged metal carport. The guests took photos as Tyler talked about Nina's diet, daily behavior, and his belief that she saw him as family. Unbeknownst to the guests, Nina had been showing troubling behavior for several days. Tyler's veterinarian friend, who occasionally stopped by to check the animals, had warned him the jaguar might be entering pre-estrus, a hormonal phase where big cats become more territorial, aggressive, and unpredictable. Tyler brushed it off, saying that she's moody, not dangerous. But wild behavior doesn't disappear in captivity. Captive jaguars retain the same instincts as their wild counterparts, and pre-estrus only amplifies their sensitivity to any perceived intrusion or competition. By 10:30 a.m., Tyler decided to demonstrate his bond with Nina. With a bucket of raw chicken in one hand, he unlatched the enclosure gate and stepped inside, barefoot as always. He waved off concerns from guests, saying that Nina knows him. He turned his back to pour food into the trough, and that's when it happened. Nina had been crouched behind a boulder near the enclosure's rear wall. Her posture was low, ears flat, eyes locked on her target. She didn't growl, she didn't snarl, she lunged. 200 pounds of muscular predator closed the 10-foot distance in a second. Her claws struck first, tearing through Tyler's side and spinning him off balance. Her jaws clamped down on his lower back, targeting the pelvis. A loud crack echoed through the enclosure, his spine fracturing under the bite force. Tyler collapsed, screaming, legs motionless. Nina didn't hesitate. She gripped his limp body and dragged it behind the boulder. Blood stained the sand as she disappeared from view. The guests outside froze. One woman screamed. A man fumbled for his phone. But no one could enter the enclosure. There was no secondary gate, no lockout zone, no way to intervene. The 911 call came at 10:34 a.m. The dispatcher recorded multiple overlapping voices, most describing a man being dragged and mauled by a large black cat. Emergency responders arrived at 10:52 a.m. They found Nina crouched over Tyler's body, her muzzle red, her ears forward, posture stiff. She stood as the officers approached the gate, displaying classic defensive behavior. When she stepped forward baring her teeth, she was shot twice through the head with a .308 caliber rifle. Inside the enclosure, the scene was gruesome. Tyler's skull had been crushed, likely from a single bite by Nina's canines. Deep puncture wounds marked his back and legs, and his torso showed signs of feeding behavior. Claw marks stretched from his hip to his ribs. The ground beneath him was soaked in blood. The investigation determined that Tyler died within minutes of the initial attack. The spinal injury had paralyzed him instantly, and blood loss from multiple arterial wounds proved fatal. There was no sign of disease in Nina, no sedatives or stimulants, no evidence of provocation. She had simply acted on instinct. The enclosure met minimum state requirements but had no redundancy. It had blind spots, no reinforced barrier between the animal and caretaker, and no emergency plan in place. Authorities concluded that the attack was preventable, not because Nina behaved unnaturally, but because Tyler had ignored basic safety measures. Tyler's remains were cremated. His sister, a schoolteacher from Las Cruces, organized a small service attended by a few of Tyler's former Army colleagues. The ceremony was held at a veterans center with a photo of Tyler in uniform placed next to a folded American flag. No one spoke publicly about the Jaguar. Within a month, the sanctuary was disbanded. The 2 bobcats were relocated to a licensed wildlife center in Colorado. The fencing was taken down, the structures dismantled, and the land put up for sale. State officials closed the investigation quietly. No charges were filed, since Tyler had not technically violated any enforceable statute. New Mexico had no comprehensive regulation on big cat ownership at the time. In the end, the state labeled the event an isolated incident. It was November 16, 2013, the Wyoming wind slicing across the plains near Cody, as a Barbary lion paced behind rusted bars in a half-acre of makeshift enclosures. Just past noon, Derek Pruitt stepped through the gate carrying a tray of raw venison, unaware that his years of reckless confidence were about to meet their violent end. Derek Pruitt was a 38-year-old former rodeo star whose fearless reputation on the bronc riding circuit had been built on calculated risk and split-second timing. When a career-ending injury forced his retirement, he channeled that same dangerous confidence into exotic animal ownership, converting old rodeo panels into enclosures on his property outside Cody. His centerpiece was Jax, a 500-pound Barbary lion he had acquired as a cub and raised to adulthood over 3 years. Barbary lions, extinct in the wild but still bred in captivity, are apex predators weighing up to 550 pounds, with 2-inch claws, a 650 psi bite, and hunting instincts that remain sharp even when hand-raised. As males mature, they grow more territorial, powerful, and dangerously unpredictable. Derek's approach to lion handling was built on dangerous misconceptions. His philosophy centered on dominance through calmness, believing that lions could sense human emotions and respond to confidence with submission. He regularly entered Jax's enclosure without protective barriers. hand-feeding the massive predator and walking the perimeter with nothing but a stick for protection. The warning signs had been mounting for weeks. Jax had been exhibiting classic stress behaviors, pacing at odd hours, refusing food for days, showing increased agitation during routine interactions. These behavioral changes are common in captive lions experiencing hormonal fluctuations or territorial stress, often preceding aggressive episodes. But Derek dismissed these red flags as winter laziness, his overconfidence blinding him to the danger signals that any trained animal behaviorist would have recognized immediately. On Thanksgiving weekend, his 14-year-old nephew Bryce had come by to help with feeding, as he often did. The enclosure's safety vestibule meant to protect direct contact was bypassed as always. Derek insisted Jax knew him too well to ever pose a threat. At 12:04 p.m., Derek entered the lion's pen carrying venison quarters. The lion lay still in the corner, watching. Derek called his usual greeting and turned his back to approach the feeding platform. That single act, turning away, was all it took. Without a sound, Jax rose and closed the distance in 2 strides. He struck with blinding speed, raking his forepaws across Derek's back and slamming him to the ground. Bryce screamed, frozen just outside the fence, as Jax clamped his jaws around Derek's neck and shook violently. The lion's bite, designed to crush windpipes and snap vertebrae, did exactly that. Derek kicked weakly for a few seconds, but Jax remained locked in, eyes fixed, unmoving. The animal's instincts had overtaken years of hand-rearing and familiarity. Bryce grabbed a metal rake and shouted, striking the bars. Jax didn't flinch. The 911 call came at 12:07 p.m. Bryce, voice shaking, told the dispatcher about the incident. When deputies arrived at 12:18, Jax was still hovering over Derek's mangled body. Officers fired a single shot, killing the lion instantly. Derek was pronounced dead on scene. His injuries matched a classic big cat takedown. Crushed cervical vertebrae, deep claw marks across his spine, and puncture wounds through the throat. The untouched tray of venison nearby made one thing clear: Jax hadn't attacked for food. He had responded to instinct. Territorial, sudden, and final. A small funeral was held on the outskirts of Amarillo, attended by a few family members, 2 former rodeo friends, and a wildlife officer who had known Derek from inspection visits. There were no speeches, just silence, wind, and a closed casket. Bryce received trauma counseling. Derek's remaining animals were relocated, and the enclosure was dismantled within weeks. State officials quietly tightened exotic animal ownership regulations, closing the loopholes Derek had exploited. It was a quiet evening in Hampshire, England, where Brandon had spent countless hours immersed in his passion for reptiles. His bedroom, tucked away in a corner of the house, was a sanctuary, a space where snakes and tarantulas lived in harmony, all under his expert care. He was a herpetologist, not just a casual enthusiast, and his collection of 10 snakes and 12 tarantulas was more than just a hobby, it was his life's work. From a young age, Brandon had been captivated by the fascinating world of reptiles. At 10, he was hooked on nature documentaries, mesmerized by the slithering movements of snakes and the silent predatory grace of tarantulas. By 15, he was holding his first snake in his hands, and from that point, his collection and knowledge only grew. Among all of Brandon's animals, one stood out above the rest: Tiny, a 7.9-foot-long African rock python. She was an impressive creature, destined to grow even larger, with the potential to reach lengths of 13 feet or more. Tiny had been with him for years, and what began as a small, manageable pet had transformed into a massive, muscle-bound serpent, coiling with strength and power. Tiny was usually kept in a secure enclosure, a large reinforced glass tank designed to house her safely. However, Brandon often allowed her out to roam freely during feeding times or when he spent time handling her. Despite her size and strength, he treated Tiny like family, caring for her with the same devotion as he did for his other reptiles. In his eyes, Tiny was more than a pet, she was a companion, an integral part of his world. But as Tiny grew, so did the risks. A python's constriction isn't an act of aggression, it's a calculated move for survival, an instinct honed over millennia. Pythons only squeeze when they're preparing to strike, when they're ready to feed. But with Tiny's increasing size and strength, Brandon knew that handling her required more caution. No longer could he drape her casually around his shoulders or let her explore freely as he had when she was smaller. The risks of handling an 8-foot python were simply too great. Yet Brandon's love for the snake often clouded his judgment. On the day everything went wrong, he allowed Tiny to roam freely in his room, underestimating the danger in doing so. August 25, 2017 began like any other day. Brandon, a landscaper by trade, returned home after work eager to relax. He lived with his parents who were downstairs at the time. Brandon's usual routine was to head upstairs to change before returning downstairs to spend time with his reptiles. But this evening, something was different. Just after heading up to his bedroom, a sudden ominous thud echoed through the house. There was no cry of pain, no shout for help, just silence. Brandon's father, hearing the noise from the living room, grew concerned and went to investigate. When he opened the door to Brandon's room, the sight that greeted him was nothing short of horrifying. There, on the floor, was Brandon motionless, his body sprawled out on the floor in a way that was entirely unnatural. Tiny was nowhere to be found. Panic gripped his heart as he called for Brandon's mother to dial emergency services. They rushed upstairs, but their attempts to revive Brandon were futile. He remained unresponsive. 8 long minutes passed before the paramedics arrived, but it was too late. The 31-year-old man, once so full of life and enthusiasm for his reptiles, was dead. Tiny, for her part, had slithered off into a corner of the room, seemingly content, her behavior eerily calm in contrast to the chaos unfolding around her. The investigation into Brandon's death was swift, but the cause of his demise was unclear. The coroner's report indicated asphyxiation, but there were no marks on his body to suggest a violent struggle. There were no bruises or bite marks, nothing to indicate that Tiny had attacked him in the way many would expect from a predatory animal. Snake expert Professor Scott Boback offered a different perspective. According to him, constriction alone wasn't the most likely cause of death in this case. Instead, he suggested that Tiny's grip might have caused a sudden restriction of blood flow to Brandon's brain, triggering a cardiac arrest. The massive pressure from the python's coiling could have caused Brandon to lose consciousness in mere seconds, and without immediate intervention, his heart would have stopped, leading to his tragic death. Further examination of the scene revealed something curious. Despite the absence of bite marks or signs of a struggle, the experts couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong, something beyond just a simple accident. Veterinarian John Cooper, who had joined the investigation, took a closer look at Tiny's recently shed skin. There were no signs that Brandon had fought for his life, no frantic claw marks or scratches. Tiny's skin was intact, and there were no indications of struggle. This was an unsettling discovery, raising more questions than answers. Despite all the evidence pointing toward an accidental death, there remained a lingering suspicion that Tiny had somehow been responsible. Could it be that the python had been acting out of affection for her owner? Snakes, after all, aren't known for the same kind of attachment that a dog or a cat might display. Their interactions with humans are often driven by instinct, whether it's for warmth, security, or simply the comfort of being close to their handler. In Tiny's case, it was possible that the snake had wrapped herself around Brandon not out of aggression, but because she had felt a need for closeness. The gripping power of the python, combined with Brandon's inability to escape, might have turned into something deadly, even if it was never the snake's intention. Adding to the mystery was the discovery of a faint rib fracture on Brandon's body, likely caused by the python's powerful coils. This too suggested that Tiny's grip had been too much. that the strength of her coils had overwhelmed Brandon's body in a way that he couldn't escape. Months after the tragedy, Brandon's parents faced a difficult decision. Despite their grief, they couldn't bring themselves to put down the python. Tiny had been an integral part of their son's life, and they didn't see her as a vicious animal. However, her growing size and the weight of the tragedy led them to rehome her. Tiny was sent to the National Center for Reptile Welfare at Hadlow College in Tunbridge, Kent. It was March 6, 2018, and late summer heat lingered in Pretoria as 15 guests gathered at Francois du Toit's property for a barbecue. The 42-year-old wildlife volunteer had built his identity around dangerous animals, a passion that began in childhood during safari expeditions across Kruger National Park. Francois thrived on admiration and attention. Friends described him as charismatic but reckless, someone who constantly pushed boundaries to impress others. What started as conservation work had transformed into something darker, a need to prove his dominance over nature's most feared predators. 2 decades of working with rejected animals had given Francois dangerous confidence. He believed he possessed some mystical connection with the wild creatures, often telling visitors that animals could sense his pure intentions. This delusion had been reinforced by years of successful interactions, creating a feedback loop that would prove fatal. His pride and joy was Napoleon, a magnificent male lion he'd raised by hand after the cub was rejected by its mother. The custom-built enclosure dominated his property's eastern section, measuring 60 by 40 feet with steel fencing over 12 feet high. Inside, Napoleon paced with fluid grace, his golden mane rippling as 420 pounds of pure predatory muscle moved with deceptive calm. African lions represent nature's most efficient killing machines. They can sprint up to 35 miles per hour, leap more than 12 feet horizontally, and generate bite forces exceeding 650 pounds per square inch. Even captive-raised lions retain fundamental predatory instincts that no amount of human contact can eliminate. As twilight painted the sky, Francois retrieved a bucket of fresh raw meat from his shed. His guests formed a semicircle around the fence, pulling out smartphones in anticipation of another feeding demonstration. The wine consumed during dinner had made Francois more boastful than usual. He stepped into the buffer area, then unlocked the inner gate, entering Napoleon's territory directly. The attack was sudden and devastating. Napoleon launched himself forward with explosive power, both front paws striking Francois simultaneously in the chest and shoulders. Before he could process what was happening, Napoleon's massive jaws clamped around his neck with surgical precision, the 4-inch canine teeth penetrating deep into soft tissue. The sound of crushing vertebrae was audible to horrified guests. Francois' cervical spine snapped like dry kindling under immense pressure. Blood erupted from puncture wounds, spraying across the dirt in arterial spurts. Napoleon's predatory instincts took complete control as he shifted his grip to Francois' left trap muscle and upper chest. The lion's powerful neck muscles contracted as he began the characteristic head-shaking motion that big cats use to tear flesh from bone. Deep lacerations opened across the shoulder and collarbone, exposing white bone beneath mangled tissue. Guests erupted into screams while someone frantically dialed emergency services. Napoleon repositioned over Francois' prone arm, his massive weight pinning the torso to the ground. The lion's jaws found purchase around the lower jaw and left side of the face, the crushing bite force pulverizing bone and cartilage. With a violent upward jerk, Napoleon tore away tissue from neck to cheekbone. Gripping the body by the torso, Napoleon began dragging his victim toward the far corner, away from screaming witnesses. Once reaching his preferred feeding spot, Napoleon settled down and began feeding methodically. Police arrived with sirens wailing as Napoleon lay contentedly beside Francois' partially consumed remains, blood matting his golden mane. A veterinarian from Johannesburg Zoo arrived with the tranquilizer rifle, but only after Napoleon collapsed unconscious could emergency personnel recover what remained of Francois de Troyes. It was a cold, crisp evening in the Penrose neighborhood of St. Louis, Missouri, the sun long gone and the city beginning to settle into the quiet of the night. Dennis Moore, a retired landscaper in his 60s, had just kissed his wife Melvina goodbye. She was off to her night shift at the nursing home, and he was preparing for his usual walk through the neighborhood. For years, this routine had been a constant in his life, a time for reflection and a break from the duties of the day. Dennis, in his simple jacket and cap, locked the door behind him and set out down the street. The world seemed to slow as he walked, the gentle breeze rustling the leaves and the muted sounds of the city blending into the background. It was during these walks that he found a kind of peace, a break from the chaos of the world, if only for a little while. The Penrose neighborhood, a tight-knit community, had always been a peaceful place. Neighbors knew one another by name and help was always just a knock away. Dennis and Melvina had made their home here for years, and their lives had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Dennis, always the Good Samaritan, tended to the lawns and gardens of his neighbors, helping the elderly and offering a friendly smile to everyone he met. It was a life of quiet satisfaction, one built on love and community. But as Dennis walked those familiar streets that evening, something was different. Unbeknownst to him, the streets of Penrose had become the hunting ground of a pack of dogs, wild and aggressive. Pit bulls, known for their strength and tenacity, had been roaming freely through the neighborhood for days, causing fear and unease among the residents. They had become a dangerous presence, unafraid of people, territorial, and relentless in their pursuit of prey. Over the past several days, neighbors had noticed the dogs jumping fences, barking loudly, and roaming in packs of 6, moving in tight formations like a wolf pack, driven by hunger and aggression. Dennis was nearing the end of his walk, just 2 blocks from his home, when the danger that had been lurking in the shadows finally found its target. His phone was dying and he planned to text Melvina once he arrived home. But as he rounded the corner and approached his block, the sudden sound of growling broke the stillness of the night. From the darkness of the alleyway, a pack of pit bulls emerged, their eyes gleaming with ferocity. They surrounded Dennis, their bodies tense, teeth bared, and growls filling the air. He attempted to back away, but the dogs were too fast, too powerful. They closed in on him, and before he could react, they lunged. The attack was swift and brutal. Dennis, despite his strength, had no chance against the sheer power of the attack. The dogs tore into him, their massive jaws sinking into his flesh, dragging him to the ground. The force of the attack was overwhelming. One of the pit bulls bit into his leg while another latched onto his arm, pulling him toward the pack's center. His cries for help were swallowed by the night as the dogs consumed him alive, the pack's primal hunger unstoppable. As the hours passed, the neighborhood remained unaware of the tragedy unfolding just a few blocks away. It wasn't until a neighbor taking out the trash stumbled upon the gruesome scene that the authorities were alerted. A call was made and the police arrived quickly, finding Dennis's body already decaying from the vicious attack. The dogs had torn him apart, leaving nothing but the remnants of what had once been a man who had loved his family and his community. Melvina, at work that night, had grown increasingly worried when Dennis didn't call at his usual time. She tried reaching him several times, but her calls went unanswered. By 5 a.m., she knew something was terribly wrong. When the police finally rang, she picked up only to hear a voice she didn't recognize. The officer on the other end asked if she was Dennis Moore's wife. Her heart sank as she nodded, but the officer refused to explain over the phone. When she arrived home later that morning, her worst fears were confirmed. She was shown only her husband's head, the rest of his body too damaged to be seen. The trauma was unimaginable and the shock left her numb. The community, which had always felt like a safe haven, was now marred by the brutal death of a beloved resident. Dennis Moore, the kind-hearted man who had always been there for others, was gone, taken by the very animals that had been allowed to roam unchecked. The investigation into the attack revealed that the dogs responsible for the savage assault were part of a larger pack. 3 of the dogs had been captured, but the police believed there were still 3 more at large. Residents of the neighborhood, already shaken by the attack, grew increasingly fearful. The dogs, known for their territorial behavior, had been seen frequently around the area, showing aggression toward anyone they encountered. They were wild, untrained, and without the necessary discipline to live safely within a human community. In total, the 6 dogs were reported to have been roaming across an area of about 500 square blocks, causing havoc as they moved through yards, alleyways, and streets. For months before the attack, neighbors had reported the pit bulls to animal control, but their warnings had gone unheeded. It wasn't until Dennis's death that authorities took action, but by then it was too late. The damage had been done, and the neighborhood would never be the same. The presence of the remaining 3 dogs, still unaccounted for, kept the residents on edge, afraid to walk the streets they once called home. Melvina, consumed by grief, suspected the dogs had been neglected or intentionally trained to be aggressive, perhaps fed raw meat to fuel their savage behavior. Without knowing the owner, the true cause of the attack remained a mystery. While pit bulls are often unfairly stigmatized, their aggression is usually the result of mistreatment. In this case, negligence had turned them into predators, roaming unchecked and becoming a deadly force in the Penrose neighborhood. Dennis Moore's tragic death underscored the dangers of failing to properly care for animals. It left a lasting mark on the community and raised an unsettling question. Are certain breeds, like pit bulls, simply too risky as household pets? Evening of March 15, 2011 settled over the suburbs outside Brisbane, Australia, with the glow of streetlights flickering on and the distant hum of televisions filtering through open windows. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of dry grass and barbecue smoke, a typical late summer night in Queensland. In a quiet neighborhood lined with modest brick houses, 34-year-old Marcus Davidson welcomed a small group of friends into his backyard. 8 guests gathered, beers in hand, the sounds of casual laughter filling the night. It was meant to be a simple get-together, but Marcus had invited them for something special, a demonstration he had been eager to show off for months. For the past 2 years, Marcus had been raising Artemis, a 150-pound wolf-dog hybrid. The massive animal, with silver-gray fur and piercing yellow eyes, was the centerpiece of Marcus's fascination with owning something wild. He spoke about Artemis as if he were something rare and mystical, a creature few could ever truly understand. To Marcus, Artemis wasn't just a pet. He was proof that a man could tame the untamable. Marcus Davidson had always lived an ordinary life. Born and raised in Toowoomba, Queensland, he worked as a postal supervisor, played sports on weekends, and was known among friends for hosting backyard barbecues. He had never owned a pet as a child. His mother had been allergic, but after his 2008 divorce, something changed. He started seeking excitement, talking about taking risks, living life differently. That was when he found Artemis. The wolf dog had been listed on a classified site, described vaguely as a timber wolf mix by a breeder in rural Queensland. The photos showed an enormous, wild-looking animal, unlike anything Marcus had seen before. He was immediately drawn to its exotic appearance, imagining how impressive it would be to own something so powerful. Without experience in handling large predators, he purchased Artemis and had him delivered. He told friends it was like having a piece of the wild in his backyard. But wolf-dog hybrids are not fully domesticated animals. Weighing between 130 and 175 pounds, they retain the instincts of wild wolves, including territorial aggression and an unpredictable prey drive. Their jaw strength exceeds 400 pounds per square inch, more than enough to crush bone, and their intelligence allows them to escape enclosures that would contain ordinary dogs. Unlike fully domesticated breeds, wolf hybrids do not recognize humans as leaders in the way dogs do. They can be affectionate one moment and triggered into a full predatory response the next. In most Australian states, wolf-dog hybrids are illegal, but underground breeders continue to supply them to inexperienced owners. Marcus had no formal training, no specialized knowledge, and no permits. What he had was confidence, and a belief that his bond with Artemis made him different from other owners. The warning signs came early. Trevor Wilson, his next-door neighbor, recalled seeing Artemis pace along the fence line whenever children passed, his yellow eyes tracking them in eerie silence. In November 2010, Marcus required stitches after Artemis bit through his forearm, tearing through skin and muscle. 2 months later, the wolf dog escaped his enclosure and attacked a neighbor's Labrador, forcing 3 men to pull them apart. Veterinarian Dr. Rajiv Patel, who treated Artemis after the dog attack, warned Marcus directly. The animal displayed clear predatory behaviors and should not be kept in a residential area. Marcus dismissed the concern, saying Artemis was just playing rough. On March 15, 2011, Marcus invited 8 friends over for drinks and a special demonstration. Witnesses later stated that Marcus had been drinking heavily, boasting about how well-trained Artemis had become. At 8:32 p.m., he led the group outside to the 1,000 square foot enclosure, where security cameras recorded the entire event. The wolf dog was already inside, pacing the perimeter, ears flat, tail stiff. His posture was tense, his hackles raised. A warning Marcus either failed to notice or ignored. He turned to his friends, grinning, and stepped inside the enclosure. For 2 minutes, Marcus crouched beside Artemis, running a hand along the thick fur at the base of his neck, speaking in a low, steady voice as the wolf dog paced in place. He had done this many times before, letting Artemis settle before guiding him into what he called their trust exercises. Moments where he would gently grip the animal's scruff or place a hand on his muzzle to show his dominance. His friends watched in silence, some with amusement, others with unease, as Marcus shifted his weight, preparing for the next step. He was going to have Artemis sit beside him, lean into his touch, and allow Marcus to momentarily place a hand over his snout, proof in his mind that their bond was unbreakable. But as he reached forward, Artemis stiffened, his body going rigid, ears pinning flat against his skull. To Marcus, it was hesitation, a sign that he needed to reassure the animal. But to Artemis, this movement was a challenge, one that required an immediate and violent response. Artemis clamped his jaws around Marcus's throat, his powerful teeth crushing the windpipe instantly. Marcus staggered backward, arms flailing, his friends frozen in shock. As Marcus fell, the wolf dog shook his head violently, the instinctive motion of a predator breaking the neck of its prey. The enclosure erupted into chaos. One guest threw a chair against the fence, another grabbed a garden hose, spraying water in a desperate attempt to distract Artemis. Nothing worked. By 8:39 p.m., Marcus had stopped moving, but the attack didn't end. With his prey motionless, Artemis began tearing into Marcus's abdomen and upper thigh, ripping through muscle and crushing bone with single-minded focus. Blood soaked into the dirt, and his friends finally realized they were watching their friend being eaten alive. Jessica Taylor, one of the friends, managed to dial emergency services at 8:40 p.m., her voice barely comprehensible through panic. First responders arrived at 8:56 p.m., but the enclosure was still too dangerous to enter. Artemis stood over Marcus's body, his ears flat, fur bristling, guarding his kill. It took 3 tranquilizer darts to subdue him. Even as the sedatives took effect, he continued licking the blood from his muzzle. By the time paramedics reached Marcus nearly 30 minutes later, he was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy later confirmed that Marcus had died from massive blood loss and asphyxiation. Defensive wounds on his hands and arms showed his desperate attempts to fight back. but Artemis's bite had crushed his trachea within seconds. The medical examiner estimated that 5 to 7 pounds of tissue had been consumed from his abdomen, chest, and legs. Queensland wildlife authorities euthanized Artemis the following day. In the days following the attack, Marcus's friends struggled to process what they had witnessed. Some refused to speak about it, shaken by the sheer brutality of the moment, while others replayed it in their minds, questioning if there had been any warning signs they had missed. The group that had once gathered regularly in his backyard for barbecues and casual drinks now found themselves avoiding the place altogether, unable to shake the memory of that night. Within the local community, the news spread quickly, with neighbors expressing a mix of shock and unease. Some had heard Artemis's deep guttural howls at night, but never imagined the wolf dog would turn on its owner. Others admitted they had always been wary of the animal, recalling the way it paced along the fence line, watching passers-by with an intensity that never felt quite right. The tragedy reignited concerns over exotic pet ownership, particularly the unchecked breeding and sale of wolf hybrids. Wildlife officials began cracking down on illegal breeders in the area, but no immediate legislation was passed to prevent similar cases in the future. For those who had known Marcus personally, his death served as a grim reminder that no amount of trust or familiarity could strip a predator of its instincts. Artemis had not acted out of malice or rage, only nature. It was September 2022 in the quiet town of Redmond, Western Australia, a place where the hum of daily life was punctuated by the soft sounds of animals on Peter Eads' farm. Peter, 77, was well known for his devotion to his flock of 60 alpacas. He'd established the Agonis alpaca stud in 1997, and each of his animals had a name. The farm was his pride, a place where he tended to his creatures with care and attention. But one creature on his farm was different. An orphaned western gray kangaroo, raised by Peter after he found it abandoned as a joey. Australia is home to over 50 million kangaroos, and while these animals are rarely a threat, they possess powerful weapons to ward off any intruders. Kangaroos have sharp claws, strong teeth, and muscular back legs capable of delivering deadly blows. The western gray kangaroo, the species Peter raised, stands about 4 feet 3 inches tall when fully grown, weighing 120 pounds. Peter's kangaroo had reached maturity in the spring of 2022, and like all male kangaroos, the surge of testosterone during the breeding season had made it aggressive. For 3 years, the kangaroo had lived alongside Peter's alpacas. It had grown accustomed to his presence, to the gentle strokes Peter would give it when he visited the paddocks. But that day, everything changed. The kangaroo, now fully matured, was no longer the docile animal it once was. With testosterone surging through its body, its natural instincts took over. Peter entered the paddock to feed the alpacas, as he had done countless times before. He saw the kangaroo bounding toward him and, as usual, expected a peaceful exchange. But this time was different. The kangaroo didn't approach with the familiar calmness he had come to expect. Instead, it charged at him. Peter barely had time to react before the kangaroo lashed out. With powerful strikes from its front legs, the kangaroo's claws raked across Peter's skin. The force of the blow sent Peter staggering back, but the kangaroo wasn't finished. It leapt into the air, using its muscular tail to maintain balance. In one swift motion, it kicked Peter with its strong back legs. The impact sent Peter crashing to the ground, stunned and unable to defend himself. The kangaroo, now fully in control of the situation, continued its assault. Peter tried to rise, but each time he attempted to get to his feet, another kick from the kangaroo knocked him back down. Its blows were relentless, powerful enough to crush bones and fracture skulls. Peter's head was struck in repeatedly. Blood pooled beneath him as his vision blurred, and the pain became unbearable. It was a rare and terrifying event, Kangaroo attacks on humans were uncommon, but when they did happen, the results could be devastating. The last fatal attack from a kangaroo had occurred in 1936. This one would shock the town of Redmond. It wasn't until hours later that a member of his family called by. They couldn't reach Peter by phone and grew concerned. When they walked to the back of the house, they spotted Peter lying unconscious in the paddock, his body bloodied and unmoving. Terrified, they called emergency services. When paramedics arrived, they rushed to Peter's side, but the kangaroo stood between them and their patient. The animal, still full of aggression, lunged at the paramedics, blocking their path to Peter. Despite the urgency of the situation, the kangaroo refused to let them near. It was only when police arrived and shot the kangaroo that the paramedics could approach Peter. Peter had succumbed to his injuries. The delay, the brutal assault, had taken their toll. By the time they reached him, it was too late. His family and the town of Redmond were left in shock. Peter had always been kind to his animals, raising the kangaroo with love. But in the end, it was the kangaroo's instincts, not its training, that dictated the outcome. Peter had spent years caring for his animals, and the irony was not lost on those who knew him. He had once saved the joey, nursing it back to health, only to fall victim to the very creature he had raised. His kindness to his animals was well known in the community. Peter had always dreamed of being buried next to his favorite alpaca, a symbol of his dedication to the animals that had been his life. In the end, that dream came true. After his tragic death, his final resting place was beside the alpaca, as he had always wished, marking a quiet tribute to his lifelong bond with the creatures he cared for. It was a hot, oppressive morning on the 10th of January 2019 when DC, a 44-year-old wildlife research scientist, arrived at the CV Yoshiki laboratory in Indonesia. The sun rose over the sprawling Pearl Farm, casting long shadows over the murky swamps where a collection of crocodiles basked lazily in the heat. The laboratory, situated within the farm, was home to a group of illegally kept crocodiles that spent their days sunbathing by the water. Among them was Mary, a 17-foot, 1,300-pound creature with a reputation that preceded her. Known for her ferocity and cunning, Mary had become a spectacle, her incredible size and strength drawing awe from those who observed her. DC had long been fascinated by the ancient reptiles, and as an animal lover, feeding them was a ritual she enjoyed. Her routine was predictable. She would arrive early, the first employee at the lab, bringing fresh cuts of meat for the crocodiles. Mary was always the first she fed, her powerful body often propelling herself out of the water to snatch the meat from mid-air with lightning speed. The crocodile was a marvel to DC, a testament to nature's raw power and efficiency. It was a graceful yet dangerous dance between them, the ritual repeated with reverence on both sides. That morning, DC approached the enclosure with a bucket of meat, her attention drawn to the crocodile's fluid movements, a constant reminder of its predatory nature. The sun cast a golden glow on Mary's scaly hide as it locked its beady eyes on the offering. DC carefully raised a chunk of meat over the 8-foot-tall wall. She had done this countless times, always careful, always mindful of the danger. But that day, in her awe, she let her guard down. With a sudden flick of its powerful tail, Mary surged upward, leaping toward the meat. DC's hand, which was too low, was within reach. The crocodile's teeth, razor-sharp and deadly, sank into her flesh with terrifying precision. DC screamed, the pain immediate and blinding. Mary, with blistering speed, yanked her over the wall and into the enclosure. The ground beneath DC cracked as she collided with the concrete floor. Pain exploded through her body, but before she could even react, Mary twisted her body with frightening precision, performing the death roll. DC's body was wrenched and tossed like a rag doll, bones cracking, blood spilling across the floor. Her screams were swallowed by the sound of crushing bone and tearing flesh. Mary's cold eyes never left her. unblinking and unyielding. DC's strength faded, her cries becoming weaker as the crocodile continued its brutal assault. Her left arm, the first to be torn away, disappeared down the creature's throat, swallowed whole. The crushing, twisting agony of the attack overwhelmed DC's senses. She was now bleeding profusely, struggling to stay conscious. As her body was lifted and slammed again, she realized she had no chance of escape. With a surge of desperation, she scrambled to her feet, searching for anything to help her flee. Her remaining arm was barely functional, but she pushed herself toward the enclosure wall, hoping for a crack or ledge to grip onto. The wall was smooth, the surface offering nothing. The momentary hope faded as her strength drained away. Without warning, DC slipped. She fell into the murky waters below, now fully immersed in Mary's domain. The water churned with blood as the crocodile moved in. Mary's movements were swift and deliberate as she entered the water. DC flailed her remaining arm, desperate to paddle toward safety. But the water was not her ally. This was Mary's world, and the crocodile was a master of it. With terrifying speed, Mary closed the distance, clamping her jaws around DC's torso. The crunch of her ribs breaking echoed through the water, and DC's screams rang out, a futile cry for help. The blood in the water was unmistakable. DC fought, her body convulsing as the crocodile dragged her deeper. Mary's grip tightened and the water began to fill DC's lungs. She could feel her life slipping away, the weight of the creature pulling her down, her vision blurring. Her mind screamed for air, for salvation, but there was none. The murky depths became her tomb. Horrified, the staff stood frozen as the crocodile emerged from the water, the mangled remains of their colleague still held tightly in her jaws. The terror was palpable as they watched the creature drag the lifeless body onto the concrete floor, leaving a trail of blood behind. DC's left hand had been severed and her torso was barely recognizable. Panic set in as the staff hesitated to enter the enclosure. They called the authorities, Tomboriri police and officials from the North Sulawesi Natural Resources Conservation Agency. The rescue team arrived, but when they approached the crocodile, Mary reacted violently, thrashing her tail and hissing in warning. She was not ready to give up her kill. With caution, the team sedated Mary and transported her to a wildlife rescue facility, where it was confirmed she had consumed DC's body. Staff at the CV Yoshiki laboratory described DC as a quiet lady who loved animals. They were deeply devastated by the death of the head of the lab. However, they noted with concern how Mary had shown prior signs of aggression, having previously attacked and killed another crocodile that had ventured into her pool. The farm's owner, a Japanese national, was arrested for illegally keeping crocodiles and sentenced to 10 years for his reckless disregard that led to DC's death. It was June 2nd, 2015. The air heavy in Calhoun as string lights glowed softly over a quiet backyard gathering. Neighbors and former students mingled around folding tables laden with potato salad and sweet tea, unaware that their host, Trish Bolin, was about to lead them toward a tragedy that would unfold in seconds but haunt them forever. Trish was a 53-year-old former high school science teacher who had channeled her grief over her husband's death 6 years earlier into an obsession with primatology. Her modest ranch home had become an unofficial educational center, where she hosted library lectures and property tours centered around her prized possession, Rafi, a 400-pound male silverback gorilla she had acquired through questionable permit loopholes in 2009. Trish had convinced herself that Rafi, hand-raised from infancy, possessed human-level empathy and could be controlled through modified sign language and routine care. She dismissed the warnings of friends who noticed his increasingly aggressive behavior, the object throwing, the territorial charging, the refusal to respond to commands. These were classic signs of a mature male gorilla asserting dominance, behaviors that in the wild would establish his position within the troop hierarchy. and she was blind to it. The custom-built outbuilding where Rafi lived featured steel framing and double doors, but Trish's deadly flaw was her belief that barriers were unnecessary between her and her roommate. She routinely entered his enclosure without protective barriers, a practice that violated every USDA recommendation for primate handling. Her confidence in their bond had blinded her to the fundamental truth that gorillas, regardless of their upbringing, remain wild animals with instincts shaped by millions of years of evolution. That evening, as the cookout wound down, Trish offered her guests a tour they would never forget. 8 people followed her across the backyard to meet Rafi, who stood silently behind the mesh door, his dark eyes tracking their movement. What they witnessed next would shatter any illusions about the gentle nature of captive primates. Trish entered the enclosure carrying a crate of ripe peaches, Rafi's favorite treat. She attempted to demonstrate their communication through sign language, but Rafi remained unresponsive, a warning sign she chose to ignore. Then, in a moment of fatal overconfidence, she reached toward him to show his tactile trust. The primate took this differently. Adult male gorillas are 10 times stronger than humans, with 8-foot arm spans and the ability to lift over 4,000 pounds. Though not naturally aggressive, a single blow can shatter ribs, and their 1,300 psi bite can crush a skull instantly. In an instant, Rafi struck her across the chest with a single open-handed blow that sent her crashing to the floor. Before she could recover, he advanced, the dominant male asserting his authority. His 400-pound frame came down on her torso with crushing force, each step breaking ribs and collapsing organs. The horror escalated as Rafi grabbed Trish by the jaw, his massive hands easily encompassing her head. With one powerful bite, he removed part of her face. His canine teeth, designed to strip bark and crush tough vegetation, tearing through flesh and bone with terrifying efficiency. The guests fled in panic, their screams echoing across the suburban neighborhood as they witnessed the brutal reality of primate power. A neighbor that heard their screams dialed 911. When law enforcement arrived 12 minutes later, they found Rafi standing motionless over Trish's body. Not aggressive, but alert, displaying the calm dominance of a silverback who had successfully defended his territory. Unaware that a dangerous animal was present, they waited for another 10 minutes for animal control to arrive. Eventually, a tranquilizer dart ended the standoff, but it was far too late for Trish. Her skull was crushed, her upper torso torn open by the immense force of Rafi's attack. The scattered peaches around her body served as a grim reminder of the trust she had placed in a creature whose nature she had fundamentally misunderstood. Rafi was euthanized the following morning, a decision made without protest or petition. Trish's family declined interviews and only a small obituary appeared in the local paper, noting her background as an educator and longtime advocate for primate care. The investigation revealed multiple violations dating back years: incomplete behavior logs, improper enclosure procedures, and lack of veterinary oversight. The property was sold, the outbuilding demolished, leaving only bureaucratic footnotes to mark the end of Trish Boland's misguided dream. The early morning sun on September 14, 2016, filtered through the dense pine forests, casting long shadows across the quiet rural roads of eastern North Carolina. The air was thick with late summer humidity, and the only sounds to be heard were the Carolina chickadees calling from the treetops. Here, in a secluded town just over 2 hours east of Charlotte, stretches of farmland and woodland separated small communities where neighbors rarely questioned what went on behind closed doors. It was the kind of place where someone could live in near isolation, undisturbed, even if they kept an apex predator in their home. At the edge of one such road, Olivia Carter's house sat tucked away behind a gravel driveway, hidden from view by a dense wall of trees. At 37 years old, Olivia had built a life of independence. She was unmarried, had no children, and worked a remote corporate job that gave her financial stability without the need to leave her property. That same financial freedom had also allowed her to pursue something far more unusual: the private ownership of a wild animal. For the past 2 years, she had shared her home with Kai, a 42-pound African caracal, a species known for its lethal hunting skills, powerful build, and unmatched agility. Unlike most exotic animal owners, Olivia hadn't built a secure outdoor enclosure or kept Kai in a controlled space. He had full reign of the house. She believed their bond made her different from other owners. But on that quiet September morning, Kai would prove that no amount of human care could override the instincts of a predator. Caracals are native to Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, built for hunting with razor-sharp claws, powerful hind legs, and keen predatory instincts. Unlike domesticated cats, caracals retain their wild nature, even when raised from birth. They strike with precision, their bite force strong enough to crush bone, and their coiled muscles give them the ability to leap over 10 feet into the air, a skill designed for taking down birds but just as effective on larger prey. Despite these facts, Olivia never saw Kai as a threat. She had imported him from a breeder outside the US, spending thousands of dollars on transport and veterinary clearances to bring him into North Carolina, a state with no restrictions on owning exotic big cats. Unlike in other states where such animals required permits and inspections, there were no legal barriers, no oversight, and no regulations preventing her from housing a wild predator inside her home. She had raised him from a kitten, treating him like a pet. He lounged on her furniture, followed her from room to room, and slept at the foot of her bed. But there had been signs. Aggressive swipes with claws extended, guttural growls when startled, a deep bite that had left a scar on her arm months prior. Friends had warned her that exotic animal experts cautioned against keeping caracals as pets, but Olivia was convinced she understood him better than anyone else could. At 10:15 a.m., Olivia was on a video call with her younger sister Erin Carter, who lived out of the state. Erin later recalled that Olivia had been standing near the kitchen counter chatting casually as she prepared Kai's raw meat breakfast. Kai was pacing nearby, his ears pinned back, tail twitching, a posture Erin had noticed before but never thought much about. Olivia had always joked that he was impatient for food, brushing off concerns, as if Kai's restlessness was nothing more than a quirky habit. Seconds later, everything changed. Kai launched forward without warning, his claws raking deep across Olivia's face before she could react. The phone jolted as Olivia stumbled backwards, screaming, the image blurring with violent movement. Erin's panicked voice rang through the call, but there was no response. Kai latched onto Olivia's arm, his powerful jaws clamping down to the bone. A loud crash echoed through the phone as furniture scraped across the tile floor, Olivia struggling to break free. The phone, knocked from her grasp, landed face up, still transmitting. Erin listened as the sounds of Olivia's struggle filled the call. Screams, heavy breathing, the deep growls of the caracal. She ended the call and immediately dialed 911. The dispatcher answered, but Erin was calling from out of state, and her location routed her to her local emergency services. She quickly explained the situation, but the dispatcher couldn't send help directly. Erin needed to call 911 for Olivia's location. They provided her with the correct 10-digit number for emergency services in North Carolina. Before dialing again, Erin frantically searched her phone for Olivia's address. In her panic, she couldn't recall it immediately, scrolling through old messages and emails until she found it. Only then did she call the emergency services for Olivia's location, relaying the full address. At 10:27 a.m., first responders were finally dispatched to the scene with animal control officers. By the time they arrived, it was already too late. Emergency responders broke through the front door to find Kai still hunched over Olivia's lifeless body, his ears flattened, muscles coiled, fur bristling. He didn't flee, he didn't hide, he was guarding his kill. The animal control officers trained in handling dangerous exotic animals moved in with catch poles and tranquilizer darts. Kai let out a low growl but didn't resist, his instincts still locked in predator mode. As they restrained him, he licked the blood from his muzzle. Erin had already hung up, but when emergency services finally arrived, she received a call she had been dreading. The dispatcher confirmed what she already feared. Olivia was unresponsive. The paramedics and police had entered the house, but there was nothing they could do. Olivia was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner's report confirmed that Olivia suffered fatal blood loss from deep lacerations to her face, arms, and neck. But the final injury had been a bite to the throat that severed her carotid artery. A precision kill, exactly how caracals take down prey in the wild. The story spread quickly, sparking renewed debates over the dangers of private exotic animal ownership. Experts pointed out that while caracals are smaller than big cats, they're still wild animals, with reflexes, strength, and instincts that no human can ever fully control. Still, no legislation was made banning the ownership of such animals. As for Kai, he was transferred to a wildlife sanctuary placed in a secure habitat away from human interaction. Officials ruled that he would not be euthanized, as the attack was deemed a natural predatory response rather than abnormal aggression. It was September 3rd, 2017, and humid Florida air hung thick over the suburban neighborhood of Lakeland, where Spanish moss draped from ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly, pushing temperatures into the mid-90s. Rick Mendez was addicted to attention and validation in the digital age. At 39, he built his entire identity around his social media presence, particularly on TikTok and Instagram, where videos featuring Princess regularly garnered hundreds of thousands of views. What had started as genuine fascination with reptiles had morphed into something more dangerous, a relentless pursuit of viral content. The backyard pool party was meant to be the ultimate content creation opportunity. His nephew Miguel's 8th birthday combined with a live demonstration that would surely break his previous view records. Ricky had been planning this moment for weeks. Princess was an impressive specimen, measuring just over 7 feet from snout to tail and weighing approximately 180 pounds. Her dark armored hide bore scars from early life in the wild before Ricky had acquired her through questionable channels 5 years earlier. The modified above-ground pool dominated the far corner of the property, originally intended for swimming but drained and converted into a habitat for Princess. The pool walls had been reinforced with concrete blocks, and a custom filtration system maintained water quality in what Ricky proudly called his backyard Everglades. American alligators represent one of nature's most successful predators, virtually unchanged by evolution for over 200 million years. They're perfectly adapted for life as ambush hunters in aquatic environments, capable of remaining motionless for hours, then exploding into action with lightning speed. The birthday party was in full swing by 4 p.m. with approximately 15 guests ranging from young children to elderly grandparents. Adults clustered around patio tables with cold beers, while children ran around the yard, their laughter mixing with sounds of Latin music that would soon be replaced by screams. At exactly 4:12 p.m., Ricky stepped over the pool's edge into the shallow water, his bare feet finding purchase on the concrete bottom. Princess lay motionless on her basking platform with only her eyes and nostrils visible above the waterline, appearing almost statue-like in her stillness, a deception that would prove fatal. What happened next defied all of Ricky's previous experience with Princess. Without any warning signs, Princess exploded into motion with terrifying speed that had made her species apex predators for millions of years. Her massive jaws opened to reveal rows of canonical teeth, and she lunged forward, clamping down on Ricky's left forearm with crushing force that shattered the radius and ulna instantly. The sound of breaking bones was clearly audible above the sudden screams of party guests. Ricky's confident smile vanished, replaced by an expression of shock and disbelief as Princess's jaws locked around his arm like a biological vice. With Ricky's arm still trapped in her jaws, Princess immediately began the death roll that is the signature killing technique of all crocodilians. She began spinning rapidly in the water, her powerful tail providing the torque necessary to generate tremendous rotational force that created devastating stress on joints and bones. Ricky's screams of agony filled the backyard as Princess continued her deadly rotation. His left arm, still locked in her jaws, began to separate from his shoulder as tendons, muscle, and ligaments were stretched beyond their breaking point. Blood clouded the pool water, creating a crimson swirl that followed the alligator's movements. Party guests reacted with a mixture of horror and paralysis. Children screamed and ran toward the house while adults stood frozen in shock. Carmen Mendez, Ricky's sister, began screaming his name while frantically dialing 911 with trembling fingers. Princess completed her first death roll and surfaced briefly, Ricky's mangled arm still clamped in her jaws. The force of rotation had torn his shoulder from its socket, and his left arm now hung at an impossible angle, connected to his torso by only a few remaining strands of muscle and skin. But Princess wasn't finished. Repositioning her grip, she released Ricky's destroyed arm, only to clamp down on his midsection with even greater force. Her teeth penetrated through his ribs and into internal organs, while the second death roll proved even more devastating than the first, spinning with mechanical precision that pulverized bone and tissue. Emergency services arrived to find a scene that defied training and experience. Captain James Morrison, a 20-year veteran, had dealt with various animal attacks, but nothing had prepared him for the blood-filled pool, floating body parts, and massive alligators still circling her victim with predatory satisfaction. Dr. Sarah Chen, the county's wildlife veterinarian, made the difficult decision to use lethal force rather than risk additional casualties. The rifle shot that ended Princess's life echoed across the suburban neighborhood, finally allowing rescue personnel to enter the pool and recover what remained of Ricky Mendez. It was March 9, 2018, as a violent storm swept through southern Scottsville, wind rattling tin roofs and rain pooling in red clay yards. Behind a small house, a flashlight beam sliced through the dark toward a camouflage shed, where Kilo, a 350-pound Bengal tiger, waited silently as laughter from the garage faded into the storm. Within minutes, that laughter would transform into screams that would echo through the hollow. Elijah Brantley was a 29-year-old recluse whose journey from auto mechanic to exotic predator owner had been marked by increasing isolation and dangerous obsessions. Once employed at a small garage outside Bowling Green, he had slowly withdrawn from steady work after a back injury and a falling out with coworkers. Over the next 2 years, Elijah poured his time and dwindling money into a remote lifestyle, one where he could pursue what he called pure control. That mindset would take physical form in the shape of a steel-framed enclosure and a dangerous growing animal few in the area even knew existed. Elijah had constructed the enclosure in secret, a concrete-floored structure welded from scrap panels and wrapped in layers of camo tarps, brush, and plywood. Hidden behind a stand of cedars and positioned downhill from the house, it was all but invisible from the road and overlooked by local authorities. He had no exotic animal license, no fencing inspection, and no veterinary documentation for the tiger's health. The shed had no external signage, no perimeter fence, and no real emergency access. He fed Kilo raw meat, chicken quarters, ground beef, expired pork, obtained through bulk suppliers who likely never asked questions. Elijah believed that feeding the tiger regularly had earned him its trust. Sandy, Elijah's cousin, had once been close to him. She hadn't visited in over a year, but had reached out recently, concerned about his reclusive behavior and rumors from neighbors. That Friday night, she and her boyfriend Drew came to see him, under the pretense of a family check-in. though really it was part intervention, part curiosity. They sat in the garage drinking cheap beer while lightning cracked over the ridge. The metal roof shook with wind gusts and water pooled around the tires of Drew's truck. Around 9:15 p.m., after a lull in the storm, Elijah stood up with a grin and asked if they wanted to see something insane. His tone was casual and joking. Neither Sandy nor Drew realized the seriousness of what he meant. Elijah retrieved a flashlight, zipped up his jacket, and motioned for them to follow. They stepped outside into the mud and walked around the back of the house, their shoes slipping in puddles and wet leaves. The flashlight cut across trees and brush until the beam landed on a sagging tarp that covered what looked like a shed. Kilo was already awake and pacing, the sound of boots in the mud and voices in the dark alerting his predatory instincts. Bengal tigers are apex predators, solitary hunters capable of bringing down animals many times their own size. Males can weigh up to 660 pounds and measure over 10 feet from nose to tail. Their retractable claws can extend over 4 inches, and their bite force exceeds 1,000 pounds per square inch. In the wild, they ambush prey from cover, targeting the neck with a single powerful bite to sever the spinal cord and cause instant death. In captivity, those instincts remain intact, triggered by movement, scent, and opportunity. As Elijah stepped through the unlatched door of the enclosure, he crossed a line that had never truly existed in Kilo's mind. The tiger did not see a caretaker. It saw a moving shape inside its domain, presenting no visible threat. There was no warning growl, no pawing or hesitation. Kilo lunged from the side of the enclosure, his body hitting Elijah with crushing impact. Elijah landed hard on the concrete, his flashlight skittering out of reach. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Kilo's jaws locked onto Elijah's neck with devastating force, the bite crushing vertebrae and severing critical arteries. Sandy screamed. Drew grabbed a rusted crowbar from beside the shed and struck the cage bars, yelling. Kilo paid no attention. The tiger shook Elijah's body, dragging him toward the far end of the shed, where blood quickly pooled under his hind legs. Kilo began feeding, methodically, silently. He tore through fabric and flesh, exposing muscle and ribs. Sandy, panicked, ran back toward the house to get her phone, slipping twice in the mud. Drew remained outside the shed, shouting Elijah's name, unable to look away. Elijah was unresponsive within the first 30 seconds. He was likely dead within a minute. Sandy's 911 call was logged at 9:27 p.m. It took over 20 minutes for law enforcement and wildlife officials to reach the property, slowed by weather and poor road conditions. When officers arrived, Kilo was still crouched over Elijah's remains, showing signs of possession and guarding behavior, ears back, eyes fixed, tail rigid. One wildlife officer prepared a tranquilizer dart, while another took position behind the patrol vehicle. A single dart was fired and struck Kilo in the hindquarter. The tiger growled, backed away slowly, and collapsed under sedation within 3 minutes. The scene that investigators entered was gruesome. Elijah's face was torn beyond recognition. His neck was broken, and his chest cavity had been partially opened. Blood had seeped into the cracks on the concrete floor. Clothing, bone fragments, and shredded meat were scattered in a 6-foot radius. Elijah's funeral was held 5 days later at a private cemetery near Bowling Green. Only a small group of family attended. No obituary was published, and no formal service was conducted. His casket remained closed. The family declined interviews and asked that the details remain private. The tiger Kilo was transferred under sedation to a secure holding facility that night. After a brief observation period, he was relocated to a licensed big cat sanctuary in the western United States. Authorities opened an investigation into how Elijah had acquired and kept the animal, but found no records, receipts, or permits. Without clear violations involving commerce or transportation, no charges were filed posthumously. The shed was dismantled within a week. The land was quietly listed for sale by Elijah's estate. There was no local press coverage beyond an initial police blotter entry. State officials issued a public advisory about exotic animal ownership, but stopped short of passing new restrictions. Thanks for watching. Don't stop here. Click the video on your screen now for more deadly pet attacks.